Now going back to Glenn's death and him being picked, and to me, I don't know if anyone else felt the same way, but I felt like Glenn's death was way more emotional because of Maggie and because of those final words. And, it was gruesome, obviously, but at the same time, it was very emotional, and to me, a bit more emotional than Abraham's death. I love both characters, but something about Glenn's death got to me, and it's tough to explain. It was very brutal. It was shocking. Obviously, it was caused by Daryl's intervention, but it was also out of nowhere as well, because Negan was pointing the other way, and then he just turns around and smokes Glenn in the head, and it's very disturbing to watch. I think most of that is because it was just out of nowhere. It was so shocking, and it felt like it came as a surprise, because for Abraham, obviously we knew he was going to die because he was picked. So we were waiting for it. But for Glenn, it was just out of nowhere, and I think that added to the emotional impact of it as well. And it's interesting because Glenn's death is almost panel for panel from the comics. It was altered, obviously, because it happened after Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo and after Abraham's death. But after that, it was just panel for panel. The hit, the eye popping out, his words saying Maggie, they did add that one line where he says, I'll find you. And I'm going to come back to that. But everything was panel for panel. Even with Negan taunting Glenn standing in front of him, he had Lucille in the back, and it's like straight from the comics. There was a panel in the comics just like that, where Negan was holding Lucille in the back and talking shit to Glenn, who he was murdering, and that just goes to show how sadistic Negan is in the TV show. This was in the comics as well, but seeing it come to life just gives it a whole different vibe. Now going back to Glenn's last words, he said, I'll find you. Now, I originally didn't understand what he meant, but after watching Talking Dead, Lauren Cohan said something very interesting. She said what Glenn meant by that was that he would find her in the afterlife as well, and that Maggie and Glenn would forever be together in this life or the next. And also that he would watch over her when he finally crosses the line and passes. He will forever watch over her and the baby. And this makes his last words so much more emotional to me, knowing what he actually meant. It was actually pretty nuts. And speaking of nuts, back to Abraham's last words, he said, suck my nuts, which, was typical of something Abraham would say as his last words. And then we, of course, have Negan and Rick coming back, and Negan forcing Rick to cut Carl's arm off. And again, how evil does a person have to be to force someone to cut off their own son's hand and say, if you don't do this, I'm going to kill every person you care about. And that's just sadistic to me. Now, there's something I want to say here. Some criticism for this specific scene. I don't know if this was a well thought of scene and basically event, or if they did this to tease comic readers and there was no substance to it, really. If there was no substance to it, then I feel like they just did that for teasing the audience, at least comic readers. And maybe that's not a bad thing, but it's just shock factor that doesn't need to be there, in my opinion. But if they did it because they actually thought about something and it was a process of coming up with that, that makes sense. But if not, then it's basically forcing that tease because something like that happened in the comics. Then after that, at the end, we have Negan saying Tata and leaving, and that specific scene was, again, one of the panels in the comics. It was exactly like that. Of course, in the panel in the comic book, only Glenn's body was in the center, but in this case, we had Abraham on the side, we had Glenn on this side, and we had a broken Rick and a broken Carl at the center. But I loved how they incorporated that Tata scene in the episode. And there's something that happened after. I don't know if anyone noticed, but when the Saviors were clearing out, and we have a shot of Rick mourning the deaths of his family and friends, we see something in the background, and it's one of the Saviors taking a Polaroid of Glenn's body, of his bashed-in head. And this goes back to the foreshadowing because, of course, in season 6, Glenn was watching images of people's bashed-in heads. And here is probably the same savior taking picture of Glenn's bashed-in head. So it seems like we had two theories about the Lucille victim, the crush theory and the Glenn and the images theory and the Polaroid theory, and both came true. And both were actually foreshadowing. So it's like they had both of these foreshadowing in there, and they both were a significant part of the story. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is Negan, and whether Negan is more hated than we want him to be. So what I'm going to say now contains spoilers from the comics, so if you're not a comic book reader or if you're not caught up with the comic book, I recommend you not watch the rest of this video. But if you are a comic reader and you're interested, stick around because I want your opinions about something. So if you're still here, that means that you are a comic reader and you know what's going on in the comics currently. So after what happened with Negan in the premiere of season 7, do you think Negan can ever redeem himself and ever be a liked character or a lovable character? Of course, in the comic book, right after Negan bashed in Glenn's head, none of us thought we would ever like him, but here we are now in the comic book where Negan has redeemed himself slightly, maybe 1%, but he has. But I'm not sure he can do that in the TV show. I don't think anyone can ever forgive Negan for what he's done. And I just want your opinions about this. Do you think that comic readers can ever forgive Negan in the TV show? And also, do you think non-comic readers and people who have never read the comics will ever be able to forgive Negan for what he's done? Or at least for Negan to redeem himself, that 1% that I talked about. This video ran very long, but that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. I'll be back for another video.